Snow drifts across a silent village as wagons roll in underarmed escort. Horses breathe clouds into the frozen air. Boots crunch over packed earth. Granary doors are pulled open, hinges screaming against the cold. Inside, sacks are stacked from floor to beam, the result of months of labor measured in blisters and frostbite. Records are checked. Grain is counted. Grain is taken. No negotiation follows. The village watches as its winter disappears into ledgers and wagons. The common belief is that the Russian Empire collapsed from war, revolution, or ideology alone, that it fell because armies failed, crowds surged, or ideas caught fire. Those explanations feel dramatic and complete, but they miss the quieter truth written into these frozen fields. The empire exposed itself by how it fed its cities and armies. Think about that. Food, not slogans, revealed the state's weakness. Grain was power. It always had been. Whoever controlled it controlled survival in a land where winters punished mistakes and distance magnified shortages. The empire understood this deeply. Bread kept factories running. Grain fed soldiers at the front. Flour calmed streets that could turn violent overnight. Food was not just sustenance. It was stability. This is why the stakes were absolute. An empire that could not balance countryside and city risked losing both. The peasant fields and the urban streets were bound together by trust, by expectation, by the belief that effort would be met with fairness. Once that belief cracked, the system holding them together began to fray. This story matters because markets do not fail quietly. When they are broken by force, they push back through hunger, hoarding, and revolt. Food systems are not abstract. They live inside kitchens, barns, rail cars, and memories. They depend on cooperation as much as command. When cooperation ends, power must replace it everywhere. At first glance, the scene looks orderly. There are lists. There are officials. There are wagons headed where they are needed. From a distance, this appears efficient, even necessary. The state acts. Supplies move. The cities will eat. The army will march. The surface logic is hard to argue with, but imagine what it feels like to stand in that village, to watch grain counted without bargaining, to hear that the rate is fixed, the quota non-negotiable, the decision final. The harvest is gone, but the winter remains. In that moment, the relationship between state and producer changes forever. Russia did not suddenly run out of grain. The land was vast, and the harvests were real. What vanished was trust. Trust that markets would function. Trust that prices meant something. Trust that effort would be rewarded rather than punished. And once trust vanished, every sack taken carried consequences far beyond the harvest. The empire had always relied on its countryside. Peasants were not merely farmers. They were the foundation of fiscal stability and social order. Their surplus fed cities and paid taxes. Their willingness to sell connected field to factory. That connection depended on incentives that were invisible but essential. When wagons arrive under escort, those incentives dissolve. Exchange turns into extraction. Cooperation turns into compliance. The state still gets grain, but it loses something harder to replace. It loses consent. It loses the signals that tell producers how much to grow, when to sell, and why to participate. This is not a story of empty land or sudden famine. It is a story of a system pushed past its limits by force. A story of officials who believed control could substitute for trust. A story of a state that learned too late that coercion can move goods, but it cannot sustain an economy. Behind each requisition lies a calculation. How much can be taken without provoking resistance? How much must be taken to keep cities alive? These calculations grow harsher as conditions worsen. Each season becomes a test of authority rather than productivity. The central question hangs over frozen fields and crowded streets alike. How did a policy meant to secure food instead destroy the very system that produced it? How did an empire so rich in land and labor expose itself through the act of feeding its people? No single order caused the unraveling. No single convoy broke the countryside. The damage accumulated. Each force taking taught farmers a lesson about risk. Each fixed demand taught them that surplus was dangerous. Each winter taught them to protect themselves first. The state saw grain as a resource to be mobilized. Farmers saw it as survival. Between those views lay the market, fragile and necessary. Once that space was crushed, everything else had to be enforced. Transport, storage, labor, and security all demanded power instead of price. The wagons roll away. The village grows quiet again, quieter than before. Snow continues to fall, covering tracks, sealing decisions into the ground. On paper, the state has succeeded. Supplies have been secured. Order appears intact. But something irreversible has occurred. The relationship between ruler and producer has shifted. Grain has moved, but loyalty has not. The empire has gained food for the moment and lost the mechanism that produced it reliably. This is the beginning of a lesson written in hunger rather than ink. An empire does not fall only when armies lose or ideologies triumph. Sometimes it falls when it mistakes control for stability, when it believes force can replace trust, when it forgets that markets are not obstacles to power, but the channels through which power sustains itself. That Russia's collapse did not start with empty shelves. It started with full granaries taken at the wrong price, in the wrong way, under the wrong assumptions. Food revealed what force tried to hide, and once that truth surfaced, the empire could no longer hold countryside and city together. This is not yet the story of collapse. It is the story of exposure, the moment when a system strong in appearance revealed the weakness at its core, when grain became the mirror in which imperial power finally saw its limits. For generations, the Russian Empire appeared immense and resilient, a land so vast that scarcity seemed almost impossible. Its territory stretched across climates and continents, anchored by Black Earth regions, whose harvests were among the richest in the world. Grain flowed outward from these fields toward railheads and ports, feeding cities at home and earning foreign currency abroad. Abundance was not an aspiration. It was a fact. Markets formed the invisible web holding this system together. Peasant households produced surplus beyond subsistence. Traders bought, stored, and transported it. Railways and river routes linked countryside to city with growing speed. Prices signaled need and reward. The exchange was imperfect, but it worked well enough to sustain scale. The empire drew confidence from this flow. Institutions grew around that confidence. Ministries tracked harvests and stocks. Warehouses buffered seasonal swings. Export contracts were signed to monetize surplus and fund industrial imports. Even under strain, Russia had always produced enough. That history shaped belief. Shortages were seen as disruptions, not structural threats. Imagine the certainty inside ministries and military offices. Maps showed fertile regions stretching to the horizon. Reports confirmed millions of tons harvested. The problem was never framed as lack of food. It was framed as distribution. Grain existed. It simply needed to be directed where it was needed most. This belief mattered. It shaped every decision that followed. Leaders assumed that volume guaranteed control. If supply was large enough, management could solve any imbalance. The countryside would adjust. Traders would comply. Railways would deliver. The system would bend but not break. That on the surface, nothing suggested fragility. Trains ran on schedule. Warehouses filled after harvest. Contracts with foreign buyers brought in revenue. Cities continued to grow, fed by rural surplus. The countryside still worked the land, season after season, because markets rewarded effort. Even as pressures mounted, the empire leaned on this history of abundance. It had survived bad harvests before. It had endured regional shortages and price spikes. Each time, the system corrected itself through movement and exchange. There was no reason, it seemed, to expect a different outcome now. TO leaders. The challenge looked logistical rather than structural. Grain needed to reach cities faster. Hoarding needed to be discouraged. Transport needed to be prioritized. These were problems of management, not trust. The solution lay in stronger direction, not reconsideration of incentives. This confidence was reinforced by scale. A system this large could absorb mistakes. Losses in one region could be offset by gains in another. Surplus provided margin. Margin provided security. The empire believed itself insulated by sheer size. Yet scale can hide strain. The larger the system, the longer it takes for signals to register at the center. Changes in behavior at the village level do not appear immediately in aggregate numbers. Production can remain high even as willingness to sell begins to erode. The relationship between state and producer had always depended on expectation. Farmers sold grain because prices made sense and markets were predictable. They accepted taxes because surplus remained. That balance was delicate, but it had endured because both sides benefited. As the state focused more intensely on directing grain, that relationship began to shift. Subtle changes appeared. Payments arrived late. Prices felt less flexible. Orders replaced negotiation in certain contexts. None of this caused alarm at first. The harvests were still strong. The trains were still moving. The illusion of strength rested on visible abundance. As long as warehouses filled and exports continued, leaders believed control was secure. The system looked durable because its outputs remained impressive. Few asked whether the incentives producing those outputs were weakening. Confidence delayed scrutiny. The empire trusted that peasants would continue to plant, harvest, and sell because they always had. It trusted that traders would move grain because profit demanded it. These assumptions were rooted in experience, not malice. That made them harder to question. What was overlooked was the fragility of cooperation under pressure. Markets are not automatic. They rely on trust that exchange will remain voluntary and worthwhile. When that trust is tested, behavior changes before numbers do. This phase is critical because it explains why the warning signs were missed. The empire did not face immediate scarcity. It faced a gradual shift in incentives. Production remained high while willingness to participate declined. The system still moved, but it was beginning to grind. Strength appeared rooted in volume, not incentives. That distinction would prove decisive. Grain existed. The land was fertile. The people farmed. But abundance alone does not feed cities. Systems do. And systems depend on cooperation that cannot be commanded indefinitely. Beneath the appearance of abundance, the relationship between state and producer was quietly changing. Each directive nudged it. Each intervention tested it. The empire believed it was asserting control over food. In reality, it was testing the limits of a market that had sustained it for generations. The illusion of strength held because nothing had yet collapsed. But the foundations were shifting. Volume still masked vulnerability. Confidence still outweighed caution. And in that gap between appearance and reality, the empire moved closer to a decision that would expose how fragile its control truly was. The braking mechanism was forced requisition. What began as intervention hardened into command as pressure mounted to feed cities and armies at any cost. Prices were set by decree or ignored entirely. Grain was taken at fixed rates that no longer reflected risk or labor. In many cases, it was seized outright. At first, it worked. Wagons arrived. Bread was baked. The appearance of control was restored. But beneath that surface, behavior began to change. Peasants adjusted not out of defiance, but logic. If surplus brought punishment instead of reward, surplus became dangerous. Fields were planted more cautiously. Harvests were hidden. Grain was consumed locally rather than sold. The countryside did not revolt immediately. It withdrew. Why grow more if it would be taken? That question spread faster than any order. It did not need slogans. It needed memory. One winter of forced taking taught lessons that lasted years. Incentives collapsed quietly, long before output did. The turning point came when coercion replaced exchange as the main channel of distribution. Markets still existed on paper, but they no longer guided behavior. Prices stopped signaling scarcity or abundance. Transport networks lost voluntary supply. Grain existed, but it no longer flowed willingly toward demand. Cause and effect were direct. Requisition destroyed incentives. Destroyed incentives reduced output. Reduced output justified harsher seizures. Each step reinforced the next. Officials reported shortages. The state responded with more force, convinced that resistance caused scarcity rather than policy. Ask what happens when producing food becomes a liability. Farmers protect themselves. They shift effort to subsistence. They hide surplus. They disengage from markets that no longer reward participation. The result is not immediate famine, but slow strangulation of supply. Transport networks clogged as supply dried up voluntarily. Rail cars waited for grain that never arrived. Storage facilities stood ready but empty. The problem was not logistics. It was trust. Without trust, goods do not move, no matter how strong the state's commands. The state misread this withdrawal as sabotage. Enforcement intensified. Armed escorts grew more common. Record checks became stricter. Each intervention deepened hostility. Farmers were no longer participants in an economy. They were adversaries in a campaign. Requisition turned officials into enforcers. Their roles shifted from managing flow to extracting compliance. This change mattered. Enforcement is expensive. It requires manpower, surveillance, and punishment. Each resource spent enforcing extraction was a resource not spent sustaining production. The economy did not fail overnight. It unraveled step by step as signals, prices, and cooperation were stripped away. Each season became harder to manage than the last. The state gained grain through force, while losing the system that produced it reliably. Grain still existed. Fields were still planted. Harvests still occurred. What vanished was the market, connecting that grain to people efficiently. Distribution depended increasingly on coercion, which scaled poorly across an empire this large. Every escalation solved yesterday's shortage by creating tomorrow's. The state fed cities briefly, then faced deeper deficits. The countryside absorbed losses, then reduced engagement further. Violence replaced exchange as the dominant mechanism of supply. This was the economic weapon turned inward. A policy meant to secure survival undermined the incentives that made survival possible. Control replaced cooperation. Fear replaced price. The system responded exactly as economics predicts. Even if politics refused to see it, by the time the pattern was undeniable, reversal was difficult. Trust, once broken, does not return quickly. Markets can be destroyed in months and take years to rebuild. The empire had chosen speed over sustainability and paid in stability. Forced requisition revealed a truth the state had ignored. Grain is not just a physical resource. It is a social one. It moves through relationships, expectations, and incentives. Break those, and no amount of force can restore flow. Russia still had land. It still had farmers. It still had grain. What it no longer had was a functioning market to connect them. And without that connection, the empire's vast abundance became irrelevant. This was the moment when policy crossed a line. When securing food turned into destroying the food system. When survival today consumed survival tomorrow. The mechanism was now in motion, and it would not stop until the consequences arrived in full. The consequences spread outward from granaries and rail lines into every layer of imperial life. Urban shortages intensified first. Bread lines lengthened. Rations shrank. What had been an inconvenience became a daily uncertainty. Cities that depended on steady inflow from the countryside felt a break immediately. When grain did not arrive, nothing could replace it. Rural resistance hardened in response. Villages that had once sold surplus willingly now viewed the state with suspicion and fear. Compliance came only under threat. Violence replaced exchange as the language of supply. Each armed convoy confirmed what peasants had already learned. The state no longer trusted them, and they no longer trusted the state. The empire paid the price through unrest that spread unevenly but relentlessly. Food producers suffered first. Their labor no longer secured stability. Their surplus invited punishment. Hunger followed not because land failed, but because cooperation did. Those who depended on that grain followed soon after. Cities felt the echo of decisions made far from their streets. Forced procurement revealed a brutal truth. When markets are broken, power must replace them everywhere. Every sack taken required guards. Every convoy required force. Every village became a point of tension. Power is expensive. It demands constant presence, constant enforcement, constant escalation. The state could not afford the system it had created that as coercion expanded. Legitimacy collapsed. The empire's authority had rested on order and predictability. When food became unpredictable, that authority dissolved. People no longer believed the system worked in their interest or even their survival. Obedience turned fragile. Loyalty evaporated. The breakdown fed on itself. Urban unrest pushed the state to extract more from the countryside. Rural resistance reduced supply further. Each response intensified the next. The empire was trapped in a cycle where every action deepened the problem it aimed to solve. Famine conditions emerged not from absolute scarcity, but from systemic failure. Grain existed in pockets. It simply did not move efficiently or voluntarily. Distribution collapsed under fear and force. Relief efforts were undermined by the same distrust that had broken markets in the first place. Political collapse followed economic collapse, not the other way around. Institutions that could not feed people could not command them either. Authority weakened where it could no longer deliver basic security. The empire unraveled under pressures it had created by trying to control too much, too fast. Those who produced food paid the highest price. They bore extraction without reward and risk without protection. Those who depended on that food followed into crisis. The state lost both sides of the balance it had once managed. Countryside and city drifted into mutual hostility. In the aftermath, new regimes inherited wreckage rather than systems. They faced empty markets, broken trust, and populations conditioned to hide rather than trade. Rebuilding supply required rebuilding confidence, a task far harder than enforcing compliance. Trust could not be decreed back into existence. The long-term lesson reached far beyond Russia. Food policy is economic policy. It sits at the intersection of incentives, trust, and survival. Control can move resources briefly, but it cannot sustain supply indefinitely. Markets are not luxuries. They are mechanisms of coordination no state can easily replace. Modern states still face the same temptation under pressure. When shortages loom, the instinct is to override markets in the name of survival. Russia's experience shows the cost. Force can win a season. It can never secure the system that feeds the next one. That the empire did not fall because it lacked land or labor. It fell because it destroyed the relationship that connected them. Once that bond broke, scale became irrelevant. Abundance could not compensate for distrust. This is the final irony. An empire rich in grain starved its own system by treating food as a weapon rather than a signal. In doing so, it revealed the limits of coercion. You can seize harvests. You cannot command trust. Russia's collapse teaches a lesson written in hunger and silence. When a state feeds itself by force, it may survive the winter, but it risks losing the system that feeds it forever. And once that system is gone, no amount of power can bring it back quickly. If this examination of hidden economic collapse sharpened understanding of how states truly fail, now is the moment to subscribe and share, so these lessons remain visible where history too often looks away.